On the island of Iona in Scotland, the highest point on the island is Dun E. And if you'll note, there's a sign here, and when you come to it, as many of us did, we called it Dun I or Dun 1. It's actually Dun E. And Dun E is located on the northwest corner of the island, and it overlooks the abbey. Standing at the top, one can see Ireland, Skye, Staffa, and Mull, and we'll hear more about Staffa next week. But looking west, the ocean is just a flat surface that ends at the horizon. A long-held belief is that St. Columba built the abbey in the shadow of Dun E so he would not have to see Ireland, his homeland. Standing on Dun E is marvelous because even when the sun is swallowed by the ocean at 11:45 p.m., the top of Dun E remains in the semi-lit deep blue-purple color until about 2 in the morning. And then about 4:55, the sun will begin to ascend over Mull, and once again, daylight resumes. Therefore, looking at the stars is challenging because you have to stay up really late at night or get up really terribly early in the morning. And I was looking forward to seeing the stars when I arrived in Iona because the light pollution in London and Edinburgh and Glasgow so brightly lit the skies it blocked out the stars. So then I was on Iona, and I was excited because this is going to be so incredible. However, because of the tilt of the earth, and I was there about June 21st, very early in the morning, it would actually become very, very dark enough to see the stars, but not when the sun goes down. And there was something wonderful and eerie about those short nights and those oddly semi-darkened skies. There was something mystical about standing on Dun E and watching the sun set, and at 12:30 in the morning still have enough light to walk down Dun E to the Abbey. In fact, there was a few nights I deliberately took my time returning to the Abbey in hopes that I would see the stars. But as you can see from a lot of these photos, if Walker were to go backward and forward, a lot of clouds covered those skies, ruining my chances to see the stars. However, finally, on my last night/morning that I was on the island, I was standing on the east side of the Abbey at about 2:30 in the morning, and it just happened that a clear spot over the Strait of Iona had opened, and there was just this gorgeous sky filled with stars. I have no photos of that because every one of them came out blurry. There's a thing called temperature and apparatuses, and I have no idea what else is in my camera, but every time I took the photo, you could just hear it going, trying to gather as much light as possible, and it just horrible photo. But anyway, watching the sun set most nights when it wasn't raining or overcast, I created a small prayer ritual. I would read a psalm and then pray as I watched in silence as the sun fell into the Atlantic Ocean, which actually blew my mind because I'd been in California, I'd watched that sunset over the Pacific, and so in my brain I always thought, yes, the sun always sets in the Pacific. And so here I'm standing on this island. I was actually making a video to send you guys, and I had to scrap it because there goes the sun setting in the Pacific. Yeah, when you're on the other side of the world, it's called the Atlantic. So I had to throw that video away. It was a mind blower. It's a mind tease. For me, it's just geographic, that hard part of trying to put things together. Anyway, when I returned to the States, I attempted to stay true to my ritual. But after a while, I had to settle on stargazing instead of sunsets, which then also became mostly cloud watching. Because in Colorado, I was unable to watch any of the sunsets because even though we were a mile high, there were mountains still higher than me looking west. And even though I was in the mountains and an hour away from Denver, the power of the artificial lights from the city masked the stars. In North Carolina, unfortunately, we were in a valley, and so the sunset took place behind a large mountain, which sadly I never reached the peak or went on to the other side. And at night, the skies were covered by clouds. But finally, in Arizona, at the Grand Canyon, I saw both the sunset and starry skies. I was able to sit on the western part of the southern rim and watch the sun set. And then as I made my way back to the campground on the east side of the canyon, I watched as the sky began with one starry white speck. And then it was joined by another and another, until like an orchestra warming up, the whole symphony began playing at once, and the sky was filled with stars on a black canvas. I was so mesmerized by the view that I found myself lying on my back on a picnic table, just looking up at this panoramic view that God had created. As I lay there, I was near my tent, which was also near another campsite, which had a youth group from Texas. And while they were gathered around their campfire, they began singing God of Wonders. And if you know the song, some of the words, the universe declares God's majesty. And it was at that moment that it was paralyzing. I wanted to get up and join them because I knew the song and I knew some of the other songs they were singing, but I couldn't move. Because in my mind I knew, and also my heart, this was going to be my one chance to really, really see the stars. I'd gone all summer, practically, without seeing many stars. And I knew there was no chance of seeing them once I returned to Detroit. Because, yeah, right, all those artificial lights. So I couldn't move. And I just remember watching this wonderful view until it was almost morning, and I realized I am not in my pajamas, nor am I actually in my bed. This is not great for my back. But that night, staring up at the night sky, out in the dark tapestry of space, among the glimmering stars, was a blue misty cloud or a ribbon, or it was weird and it's hard to describe. It was kind of like a blue smoke or a blue haze, and it just hung out in space, and it was gorgeous. I looked it up online the next day and discovered that this is actually space dust, illuminated by the sun rays as it goes around the earth. That night, multiple times I attempted to photograph what I was seeing, but my camera could not capture what my eyes saw. And even though later attempts to look this vision up online resulted in things that weren't what I saw. But this doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This blue mist just is there. And according to NASA, it's basically hidden because of the artificial lights from our buildings and our street posts. And please note, I'm not complaining about artificial lights. After all, these lights allow us to remain productive after the sun sets. And artificial light can create security by allowing one to see in the darkness. And trust me, after hitting 2 elk and being stuck in the darkness in Montana, I certainly recognize the need for artificial light. Yet, though I recognize the importance of artificial light, studies have shown that artificial light can be harmful to our health. Especially that little blue light that's emitted by our tablets or our phones. Studies show that persons who sleep with their phones are wakened by the blue light they emit because the blue light slows or halts the production of melatonin, a chemical in our brain that tells us it's time for bed. This lack of sleepiness interferes with the rest our brains and bodies need. So one way to avoid this interference is to go dark, a phrase most people use to describe when they deliberately turn off their digital devices. And for example, when I was at Wild Goose Conference in Hot Springs, North Carolina, there was a young man I met who kept announcing to people that he was intentionally going dark. He was deliberately avoiding anything techie. And any time we had a meeting that involved a laptop or PowerPoint, he would simply bid us adieu and leave because he wanted to go dark. At the end of the week, he said that in his quiet solitude, he discovered that there were small things he had neglected to care for in his life because he allowed his life to be dominated by techie stuff like phone calls and emails. He discovered that he measured his value to others by the number of times the phone rang or the number of emails he received. But he discovered in that time of darkness that he was far more valuable than what these messages told him. When he went dark, he found tiny lights that were already in his life that actually mattered more than receiving messages. In Philippians, Paul suggests that he experienced something similar to my friend as he traveled on the road to Damascus. When Paul wrote his letter of Philippians, he was sitting in a dark cell, and in the darkness, he realized that prior to his encounter with Christ, he relied on bright spots in his life that had nothing to do with Jesus. Paul's list of bright spots included his birth into the ancient Israeli tribe of Benjamin. And Paul says he was a Pharisee, which meant he viewed himself as a pious man, obedient to the law of Moses. Like other Pharisees of his time, he was fanatical in his devotion to the law, and he persecuted persons who broke the law. However, as Paul stated, in his opinion before he met Christ, he viewed himself as blameless in the eyes of the law because he considered himself outside the law when he judged people who broke the law. When Paul was blinded by Jesus on the road to Damascus, he discovered in that darkened place that all of the things he once held dear and considered as gains were actually losses. He discovered his identity was artificial and did nothing to gain eternal life or please God. While sitting in darkness, Paul found that the only light he truly needed in his life was the light of Jesus, who illuminated his darkness and brought hope and joy like stars on a nighttime canvas. For Paul, it took the darkness to see the true light. He needed the artificial things he thought mattered to go dark so he could see what truly mattered to God. Perhaps like Paul, we have artificial lights in our lives that pollute our minds and our lives and cause us unrest, or cause us to lose sight of the bigger panoramic view of God. Like Paul, perhaps there's an artificial light that we rely on that tells us we have value or worth, but it's false. It's artificial. And when we flip the switch and turn off these false lights, we discover in the darkness the light and love of Christ, which is evident and is important to our lives and our well-being. Jesus' light is always present, but perhaps, like the stars blocked by this artificial light, Jesus' presence is hidden because of an artificial light that shines brightly on our gaffes and our failures, and they cause us to feel guilty and unworthy of God's love. Hopefully, when we choose to go dark, there are times that we can find God. And then it's important to note that like our inability to stop or even slow a sunset, there are times we are forced to go dark. We are forced into darkness when we encounter an illness or an accident or things beyond our control. This week, I visited with one of I wouldn't call him a church member, but he's a friend of the church, Milt Miller. And Milt is currently in a nursing home going blind because of his lack of sugar levels, diabetes. So in this darkness, he said during our visit, he is angry, and he's frustrated, and he's disturbed. But as we sat and talked about this, he finally said, "You know, Pastor, as I sit here in darkness, I've discovered that the light of God has not dimmed." He added that when he feels these waves of despair washing over him, he says at those moments he can feel God shining in his light, or in his life, And when he feels that light shine, he says it's when God sends friends or family members to visit. He also said what he thought mattered in life has turned out to be, and I'm going to use Paul's words because his word wasn't all that church appropriate, it feels rubbish. All that matters is that God has not stopped loving him. And in the darkness, he's not alone. He's discovered that it's okay to be weak and it's okay to sit in darkness. For in the darkness, he can see God's shining light in his life. Another example of God shining in the darkness is an account given by former Vice President Joe Biden. He said when his son died, he found himself surrounded by darkness. He wasn't sure he could ever escape its grasp. But he said his wife, Jill, taped an expression from Soren Kierkegaard to a mirror in their home. The expression was, "Faith sees best in the dark." This phrase is a constant reminder for us to embrace the darkness and to allow it to surround us, so that in that space we can witness the light of God which shines brightly in our lives. Thankfully, in the darkness, we discover the bright light of Christ that is constantly shining in our lives. And as one author remarked when observing Christ's light in the darkness said, that it's a curious thing about the darkness. Darkness reveals the light. When we turn off these artificial lights that distract us, we can truly see what is important. And then, as Paul said in his letter, we can leave that rubbish behind. As we contemplate the bright light of God and focus on what's truly important in our lives and we leave that rubbish behind, we will see Christ emerge in our lives. When we're willing to experience the light of Christ shining in our lives, we not only become healthier, we also find the goal that Christ has in mind for us. The question becomes, other than televisions, cell phones, tablets, and all our tech gizmos, what else do we need to turn off so we can observe God's shining light in our lives and see God's beautiful, bigger, panoramic picture in store for us?